Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to join us on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. An author, journalist, and anthropologist, Stanley Kurtz is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a contributing editor to National Review Online. Stanley's latest book, Radical in Chief: Barack Obama and the Untold Story of American Socialism. Stanley, welcome. Segment 1. Stanley Kurtz was wrong. I'm quoting you, Stanley, from Radical in Chief. When I began my research for this book, my inclination was to downplay or dismiss evidence of explicit socialism in Obama's background. I thought the socialism issue was an unprovable and unnecessary distraction from the broader question of Obama's ultra-liberal inclinations. I was wrong, close quote. Why were you wrong?
Well, Peter, it's true. During the campaign, I wasn't exactly shy in 2008 about calling Obama a radical, about saying he was much, much further to the left than he advertised himself. But even I didn't think at that time that he was literally a socialist. But when I looked into his past, I saw unmistakable socialist experiences, a phase of his life when he literally was a classic Marxist-Leninist.
When I looked into his past, when did you do that? After he was elected?
Well, during campaign 2008, I began my research on Obama's past, and that research helped to inject the issues of Bill Ayers and Acorn into the campaign. But it was after the 2008 election that I really began going all around the country, looking into archives of community organizations and radical groups that Obama had had involvement with throughout his life. And my jaw dropped at certain points when I saw material from socialist scholars conferences, for example, where it was clear that Obama had attended, that linked to his entire political career.
But Stanley, what was there left for you to discover? The man had run for president of the United States. Thousands of journalists had been watching him for 2 or 3 years, of course, faithfully doing all the work, uncovering every stone, turning over every leaf to learn all they possibly could about this man's background. Correct?
Right. There was really no serious effort to vet Obama during the 2008 presidential campaign, and such material as did come out was really ignored, I think, very consciously and systematically by the mainstream press. A lot of people said that Hillary Clinton must have found everything there was to find in her opposition research. Of course, none of that was true, and even I, who had done research in 2008, was tremendously surprised by the paper trail that you could uncover on Obama.
But it took time, and it took somebody willing to do the work of turning up at archives, asking questions, doing research. All right. You discovered a socialist connection. Define socialism. Here's what's on my mind. Reading the Wall Street Journal this morning over my cup of coffee, I came across their phrase. They were talking about what John Boehner, the new speaker, needs to understand, and he needs to understand that Obama is, quote, I made this a mental note, a determined man of the left. Why won't that do? Why do we need to know that he is a socialist?
Well, chiefly because the community organizers who were the mentors and sponsors of Obama actively thought of themselves as socialists. It's just that they had a notion that you should keep this secret, that you should not speak to the people you organize about your socialism, but you should use it only for your own strategic purposes. And getting back to your larger question of definition, the classic definition of socialism, of course, is that you get complete national control of the means of production. The whole economy is run by the government. What people don't understand is that socialism began to change in the United States after the 1960s. The new leftists, the people from the SDS, they became frustrated after 10 or 15 years when they realized we're not going to have a socialist revolution in the United States. And of course, when Ronald Reagan became president, it became clear that you weren't going to have a nationalization strategy. So at that point, socialism changed. And the thought was to get a kind of de facto public control over the economy from below. Not through nationalization from above, but through community organizing from below. So, for example, people are familiar with the way Acorn...
Acorn, give us a moment. The acronym stands for?
the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now.
All right.
And ACORN, one of the most powerful and prominent community organizations in the country, effectively got control of the banking sector and actually was able to carve out a whole territory within the banking sector for subprime mortgages. People who would previously never have gotten loans because they had risky credit histories could get loans now, and those loans were handled through ACORN and similar organizations. Now, the socialists of the 80s saw that as a model for socializing the economy from below. So this was the new strategy of socialism that came out after the 1960s, and this, I argue in the book, is the strategy that entranced Obama.
All right. Segment 2, Obama, the student and young man. Again, Stanley, let me quote to you from your own book, From Radical in Chief. You provide a kind of one-paragraph summary of Obama as a socialist. Quote, from his teenage years under the mentorship of Frank Marshall Davis, to his socialist days at Occidental College, to his life-transforming encounters at New York Socialist Scholars Conferences, to his immersion in the stealthily socialist community organizer networks of Chicago, Barack Obama has lived in a thoroughly socialist world, close quote. So take us through that. Alas, it's a webcast. We have to kind of live up to the demands of the metabolism of television. But the teenage years and Frank Marshall Davis, who was that man?
Well, Frank Marshall Davis was an African-American, a very accomplished journalist and poet who was a kind of mentor to Obama in his high school years. And Frank Marshall Davis had at one time been a member of the Communist Party. Now, he left the Communist Party, but he really retained his radicalism and his socialism. And in his own memoir, Obama speaks of trying to follow Frank Marshall Davis's advice not to lose his cutting-edge political sensibility when he went to college and became an adult, not to sell out, not to buy into the system. And we find that when Obama was in Occidental College, and this is information that has come out since 2008, but was not available during the campaign, when Obama was at Occidental, pardon me.
I'll vamp for a moment. Occidental,
I'll start that again.
prestigious liberal arts institution in Southern California, not known as a hotbed of socialism, I don't think. Jack Kemp is a graduate of Occidental.
Well, that's true. Kemp is from Occidental, but there are a number of Marxist professors, in the words of Obama himself, at Occidental.
All right.
When Obama was at Occidental, it's pretty clear now, we have this from both pro-Obama and critical of Obama sources, he really was a socialist in the classic sense. He was a Marxist-Leninist who looked forward to revolution. But after that...
Now, but Stanley, he's 18 and 19 years old.
Absolutely.
So, all right, go ahead. I'm thinking now, I have a kid at college. I don't know quite what her political beliefs are, but I don't take them seriously one way or the other. On the other hand, she's not president.
Right, but that's why you put your finger on the issue before when you talked about this continuous thread.
All right.
That's what the book really argues. Of course, a lot of people go through radical phases in college. They go through all sorts of crazy things in college and they leave it behind. But that's not what happened to Obama. And that's what the book does really, is to trace this continuous path. So, for example, when Obama transferred to Columbia University, he was in New York City, and the book really begins with a series of socialist scholars conferences that Barack Obama attended when he lived in New York between the years of 1983 and 1985. And I argue in the book that it was at these conferences that Barack Obama first learned about community organizing and the crucial role that community organizing played in socialist strategy. This, again, is where socialism changed. The idea was to grab hold of the economy from below through these community organizations. And this was the idea presented at the various socialist scholars conferences Obama attended. And then what did Obama do? He moved to Chicago. And who did he work with?
Hang on, you're skipping over Harvard Law School. Harvard, when there's some nefarious development in a person's life, and Harvard often plays a role. Give us a...
Well, actually, Obama went to Chicago both before and after Harvard Law School. And it's true at Harvard that he interacted with various left-leaning professors and whatnot. But really, the book concentrates on the community organizers that Obama worked with both before he was at Harvard Law School and after Harvard Law School. They really were the community organizers who were the model of what those socialist scholars' conferences had focused on.
Let me ask you another question, Stanley. He was in New York at Columbia from 83 to 85. The backdrop in those years is Ronald Reagan is president. He cuts taxes. He rolls back regulations. Beginning in the summer of 1983, the economy recovers. In 84, he's reelected 49 states out of 50. By 85, inflation is down to low single digits. The economy is roaring. The Soviet Union is on the defensive. And Barack Obama is moving to the left. Do you get any sense that he's engaged at all with the larger political context, with the evidence all around him that freedom capitalism works?
Well, Barack Obama, during the Reagan years, saw himself as at the cutting edge of resisting Ronald Reagan. I think he would have answered your case for Ronald Reagan by saying that Reagan was pulling the wool over the eyes of the American people and blinding them to the poverty that still existed in the country. That's what Obama was focused on. For example, these stealthily socialist community organizers he worked with, they sponsored the political career of a congressman in Illinois named Lane Evans. Mm-hmm. Lane Evans represented a district which had traditionally been Republican, and yet through very clever organizing work, he was able to be elected in conjunction with these community organizers. He had the most anti-Reagan voting record of anyone in the House, or at least close to that, during the Reagan years. And on Obama's election night, when he was watching television on election 2008, Lane Evans was sitting next to him, a symbol for him of resistance to Reagan at the very height of the Reagan administration.
All right, segment 3, Obama activist and politician. We've got him through his boyhood. Now he's back in Chicago. Stanley, you used the phrase, you've told us about Acorn, you used the phrase community organizer. What is a community organizer? I paraphrase Sarah Palin at the Republican convention. What do community organizers do?
Well, community organizers take discontent that exists wherever and try to turn that discontent in the direction of their true long-term political goals. And since I argue in the book that the leadership of community organizing in the United States is largely socialist, the real answer to this question is community organizers take discontent and try to use it as a lever to move the public gradually towards socialism.
Bill Ayers, tell us who he is and what his role was in the development of Barack Obama as a mature politician.
Well, Bill Ayers represented the kind of new leftist who was in many ways the opposite of the people who became Obama's core mentors. Obama's core mentors were the members of the SDS in their day.
Students for a Democratic Society.
Yes. And they were the people who said, let's not have a violent revolution now because it's just not going to work. Let's turn to community organizing. Let's work incrementally. Let's work quietly, stealthily, and slowly. At first, of course, Bill Ayers and his wife Bernadine Dorn, leaders of the Weather Underground faction, were the total opposite of all that. They believed in setting off a revolution right away by blowing up bombs. They thought the American public would rally to them. It was only later that Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn realized that they had made a mistake, that they had failed, and they took up something much closer to what their SDS colleagues who were more cautious had advocated. And so at that point, when he was a mature individual living in Chicago, Bill Ayers was really part of this stealthily socialist world of community organizing. And he brought Obama on to the leadership of an education foundation that Bill Ayers, had created. And I show in the book that Obama actually brought Bill Ayers onto the Woods Fund to help him. And what they both were doing in all of their foundation ventures was giving financial support to this stealthy network of socialist community organizers.
And now earlier you gave us the example of Acorn, which organizes at the grassroots level, makes common cause with, I'm adding this to your description, but I think I understand it to be your argument, and they make common cause with the Barney Franks of the world. There are a few leftist members of politicians, yes, in high positions who then use the levers of government effectively to command large swaths of the private economy.
Yes.
All right, that's the acorn example. What's going on in Chicago? What socialist achievements does this stealthy network of community organizers have to its credit?
Well, Bill Ayers in Chicago was a key figure in the school reform movement, which was envisaged by Ayers and his group as a kind of practice for getting community control of government. And they saw that as groundwork for a long-term move in a socialist direction. And this was actually fought by the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions were to the right of the school reform faction, which wanted to have local elections essentially so that these community organizations could get control of the school system and ultimately as much of the government as they could. And in a broader sense, the achievement of socialist community organizers in Chicago was to ally, as you were speaking earlier about Barney Frank, to ally with Mayor Harold Washington when Mayor Harold Washington was alive. The interesting thing about this was that Mayor Harold Washington actively and openly worked with Chicago's socialists. He allied with these community organizations and they helped bring him to victory. And one of the things I say in the book is that when Obama was first drawn to these socialist scholars conferences, all the talk in the socialist world was about how community organizing could be linked to politics on the model of Harold Washington. And of course, Harold Washington was Obama's idol, his vision of what he might someday be. And the thought of America's socialist in the mid-'80s was that Harold Washington, in his alliance with socialist community organizers, was a kind of example of how African-American-led rainbow coalitions would bring socialism into the mainstream of American politics.
Here's what strikes me again, Stanley. I mentioned this earlier about Obama sees Reagan's agenda working, or should see it working. He can say to himself that Reagan is pulling the wool over people's eyes, but that's Obama pulling the wool over his own eyes, because we know that, for example, two of the groups that made the most dramatic advances during the Reagan recovery were African Americans and women. So then you get Harold Washington, and whatever dreams there are of remaking Chicago don't work. Harold Washington's tenure as mayor is widely viewed as a failure, and when Richard Daley, the current and soon-to-be former mayor, finally agrees to run for mayor, there's a huge sigh of relief throughout the Chicago body politic, finally a grown-up again. So we've got Barack Obama making common cause with a group of people who just are ineffective.
Well, I buy what you're saying, but let me try to answer from what I think would have been Obama.
What's he thinking? That's the question, yeah.
Right. I think actually we could go back to Jeremiah Wright here with his famous...
Okay. Jeremiah Wright is?
Well, Jeremiah Wright, of course, being the controversial minister that brought Obama into Christianity. And Jeremiah Wright is famous, and some would say notorious, for saying, fight middle classness, oppose middle classness. So, whereas Ronald Reagan would have seen increasing numbers of blacks moving into the middle class and maybe moving out into the suburbs as a triumph.
Yes, fight to get into the middle class.
Exactly. Right. But Reverend Wright and Barack Obama saw that as abandoning the poor people who remained in the city. Fight middle classness. That meant don't go the traditional American Horatio Alger route. Instead, get government programs that will get these people out of poverty. They didn't really see moving into the middle class as the wonderful antidote to poverty that it is. They saw it as a betrayal of the lower class.
Segment 4, the disguise. Let me quote to you once again from Radical in Chief. At every turn, I'm quoting, at every turn Obama has disguised his socialist past. Close quote. Explain that.
Well, in the book, I come across incident after incident where Obama has not told the truth to the American people about his political past, and he does this in different ways. Sometimes he lets a little bit slip out. So, for example, he says, when I was at Occidental College, I hung out with the Marxist professors. Well, we now know that he wasn't just hanging out with the Marxist professors. When he was at Occidental, he fully agreed with the Marxist professors. He was a very strong Marxist-Leninist at that time. He moderated later only in the sense that he came to this new stream of socialism. But at any rate, that gives you the sense of how Obama has a kind of non-disclosure-disclosure pattern. But it goes beyond that. One of the things I do in the book is to look into Obama's relationship with Acorn. I went to the previously unexplored archives of Acorn at the Wisconsin Historical Society and found that Obama had an extensive relationship with that organization over a period of many years.
You quote Barack Obama in Radical in Chief during his third debate with John McCain, quoting Barack Obama, "The only involvement I've had with Acorn was I represented them alongside the U.S. Justice Department in making Illinois implement a motor voter law," close quote. The only involvement he had with Acorn. Just not true?
That's where I use the L word, the lie word. I usually don't like to use the word lie. I say, well, it wasn't fully frank with the American people or whatnot. But I really think we have so much documentation now that we can fairly say that Obama consciously and knowingly lied to the American public about his relationship with Acorn during the 2008 election campaign. So really, Obama's tactics of disguise range from these non-disclosure disclosures to flat-out lies and almost everything on the spectrum in between.
Why is he disguising this? Barney Frank lets you know where he stands. Got elected over and over and over again from Massachusetts. Jeremiah Wright, Lord knows he'd let you know where he stands. Bill Ayers lets you know where he stands. These are, so what's the disguise here?
Well,
Why is he going undercover?
I really don't think you could get elected as President of the United States if you acknowledged, frankly, how far left you really were. You may do it in Barney Frank's district. Bernie Sanders can say very frankly that he's a socialist and get elected as senator from Vermont. But it's just not going to fly with the American public to be President of the United States. And that's my real problem here. I'm not calling for boycotts of supporters of Bernie Sanders, banning them from work like in the blacklist days. I think this is really an issue of political honesty, which is required if democracy is going to work.
It starts early. I don't mean to be tendentious. I'm just trying to draw you out here. I am genuinely curious about this. Obama serves in the Illinois state legislature, and then he's a senator from Illinois. Now, surely the legislature, the state legislature, has small enough districts you could get elected from Hyde Park, or this you can choose, and you could say I'm a man of the left, and they'd elect you, right? You could do a Bernie Sanders, but he didn't. Even then.
Well, I think he was a little bit more frank about his leftism when he was from Hyde Park, but from the moment that Obama was at Harvard and was selected as the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review, he knew that he had the potential to have a major national career. And I think from that moment, he was very cautious and very careful. All right.
So from the age of what, he's 24 when he shows up at Harvard, we have here, this seems improbable, but I think you argue that it's just factually the case. We have to conclude that it's the case. At the age of 24, he's a convinced man of the left and convinced of his own talents and future. At the age of 24, he thinks he'll become a national figure. True?
His immediate goal was to become mayor of the city of Chicago. That was his dream. Harold Washington was his idol. But once he was selected as editor of the Harvard Law Review, he realized that it could go even higher than that. I mean, if you were just a law student and all of a sudden you were in the New York Times and people were paying you a lot of money for your life story, you'd be pretty optimistic about your political future too.
Once again from Radical in Chief, Stanley, I'm quoting you. If the full extent of Obama's radicalism has been kept under wraps by Obama himself, it should nonetheless have been obvious in 2008 that Obama was far from the post-racial, post-ideological, post-partisan politician presented to the country by the mainstream press and the Obama campaign alike, close quote. Two questions. Why did the mainstream press so willingly collaborate, one almost might say, in putting across what ought to have been clear to them was a fabrication?
Well, of course, there was a genuinely inspiring story in 2008 of America coming close to and then finally electing the first African American as president. It was a deeply inspiring story, and I think we can all get some inspiration from it. And
so you cut everybody involved a lot of slack.
I don't actually. cut them slack, but I'm just trying to explain what they were thinking.
All right.
And I think that's a large part of what they were thinking. And I think at least some members of the media were a little bit more savvy than that, and they knew that this fellow was far to the left, and that was exactly what they wanted, and they didn't want to give the game away.
Andrew Ferguson of the Weekly Standard, quote, "There is indeed a name for the beliefs that motivate President Obama, but it's not socialism. It's liberalism." This is a refrain in review after review, even quite friendly reviews of the book. Look, Stanley has all kinds of factually compelling material here, but who cares? Why go into this strange John Bircher, slightly crazy, McCarthy, all kinds of accusations can attach to you if you're saying socialist.
Right.
So why do you do it? I return to this. How would you distinguish between, and if Andy were here, how would you explain to him that he's mistaken, that it's not just liberalism?
Well, there's an overlap between the program of modernized socialism and contemporary liberalism. And part of what socialists did was to work within the Democratic Party, quite self-consciously, but seizing on those elements of the standard liberal program that were most likely to put the country on an irreversible structural path towards socialism. Now, look at what President Obama did with the health care bill. Where it's just coming out now that most of his advisors told him not to focus on health care. They said this is politically very damaging. Obama actually moved in that direction against the advice of almost every senior political advisor he had. That, to me, is a sign that we're dealing with something a little different than the standard liberal agenda. And there are, and I talk about this in the book, other little things like proxy access. No one pays attention to this, but Obama's mentors believed in something they called corporate democracy. This, again, was the idea of grabbing hold of the economy from below, getting a kind of de facto public ownership. Things like that have been salted into the financial reform bill, and no one pays any attention to it. And it's really understanding the socialist background that reveals that. But I also have to say, if people only decide that Obama is way far to the left of where he's presented himself, I'd be happy with that.
You will have done a good day's work.
Yeah, you don't have to buy the whole deal.
Segment 5, then. This brings us to what we've been inching up toward, why it matters. Radical in chief, quote, it could be argued that Obama's past no longer matters. After all, now we can judge Obama by what his administration does, rather than by whatever he did or did not believe in the past. Stanley Kurtz, I argue that the truth is the opposite. When it comes to Obama, the past, in a sense, matters more than the present. That is an outlandish assertion, Stanley. Defend it.
Well, here's where we can come back to the Ronald Reagan comparison that's come up a few times. I mean, Reagan leveled with the American public. He made no bones about it. He was conservative. He explained that. He helped to bring the public along to convince them. And if he was opposed, it was for honest reasons. Obama hasn't done that. Obama has not advocated any ideology openly. He has cast many of his most ambitious plans as just pragmatic fixes to the economy. I don't think that's true. And if you don't understand that there is an ideology laying behind this, you're not going to be able to really evaluate these reforms Obama is laying out. For example, regulation. And we're coming up to that now with a Republican Congress. Obama is going to be achieving so much of his real program through executive regulation. Now, the mind of the president means everything. Whether you're just going to regulate in such a way as to fulfill the wishes of Congress and create a pragmatic system fix, or whether you're going to use the laws to try to provoke a much more radical systemic change by abusing the regulatory process, that has everything to do with what your true inner intentions are.
So what you're arguing is something like he's fixed the game. In democracy, the model of democracy is competing views, but that the public is allowed to choose between openly, fairly competing views. If you have people who seem to be competing in one way but aren't really, it's like a violation of all that we hold sacred in the game of baseball. The pitcher isn't allowed to throw the game. That's a very serious offense. You get kicked out of the game. You get yanked from the Hall of Fame if you do something like that. That's what's going on. All right. So that's an extremely serious charge you're making, that he is in effect subverting the democratic process by holding back on his true convictions and most abiding motivation. And that is the charge you wish to make.
That is the charge I'm making, and frankly, it's already been made. I mean, you go back to healthcare reform, and people said that Obama's real long-term plan was to move to a single-payer system. And you may remember there were controversial videotapes that came out where he said exactly that. Obama then said, well, I'm not really feeling that way anymore. Don't play those tapes. They're really totally irrelevant. The public didn't buy it. That helped to launch the Tea Party movement. And what I'm saying in the book is that whole thing is going on everywhere. It's much more extensive than you realize. It isn't just those little clips of videotape. In effect, by going into the archives, I'm pulling out tape after tape of what his real long-term intentions are.
All right. Now, as we sit here chatting this morning, John Boehner is becoming the new Speaker of the House. 63 new Republicans are being sworn in. Today is the first. They are reading the Constitution in the House chamber as we speak. Rush Limbaugh referred to it on the air this morning as an exorcism. So here's the new argument that I put to you, Stanley. Barack Obama may have concealed his true intentions in the 2008 campaign, but over the last 2 years they got revealed. The American people are on to him. And in the last election, they said, stop it. No way, we oppose this. 63 new seats in the House for Republicans, a majority of 59, not quite a majority in the Senate, but picked up seats in the Senate, some 600 new seats in the state legislature. So, although radical in chief is of fascinating historical importance, what does it matter to the contemporary context?
Well, there's still a lot of people out there, Peter, who buy the pragmatist argument. You'd be amazed. I know some of them. You know, not everyone I know is conservative, and people who are absolutely entranced with Obama as he presented himself in the 2008 campaign and have never lost the faith. And in fact, in some polls, his popularity is coming up, and it's by no means impossible that Obama could win re-election. And at that point, I think we'd be right back in the soup as far as what his real long-term intentions are. When he didn't have to worry about re-election anymore, he'd go to town. And so I think this is a very serious business, and one of the things I argue in the book is that conservatives mustn't get overconfident that Obama has a surprisingly plausible strategy for making these long-term transformations. I lay that out in some detail. That, for example, is why he arranged for this tax compromise to come up again for reconsideration, not in 1 year or 3 years, but in 2 years. He wants to have a class-based battle over the Bush tax cuts. He can't do it now in light of the election that we've just had, but he wants to have it in 2012. So this is a very serious business, and conservatives shouldn't take victory for granted.
So in his thinking, you've talked about socialism in this country changing in the 60s and then again in the 80s to an effort to capture the economy from below. He's not below anything right now. He's the top man in the country. So the question is, in his understanding of the socialist trajectory, is he committed throughout his time in office, whether it is 2 more years or 6 more years, to deceit and sleight of hand and giving the American people something he believes they ought to have but that they don't want? Or is it his understanding, and those of the Bill Ayers and Jeremiah Wrights of the world, that by about now, the American people will be coming around, that by the time they re-elect him, he can be a pretty forthright man of the left. It won't matter that his true intentions, that Radical in Chief has been published, because by then the American people will have bought on to socialism. At some point, they must believe that they're actually going to conquer the hearts of the people.
I think it's a little bit of both is the answer, and there is a strategy for creating class-based conflict. I mean, that's why we saw President Obama do these things that surprise many people, like attacking the Chamber of Commerce and telling Hispanics to punish their enemies. There is a desire to jumpstart a populist anti-business movement of the left. Now, it wouldn't be openly socialist. The idea, the long-term plan of Obama's community organizing mentors is that you jumpstart a populist movement. You don't call it socialist. You just steer it from behind using socialist strategy. But there are all sorts of efforts to jumpstart that populist movement of the left, and even at the cost of alienating some people in the center. So I think there's a desire to hold as many people in the center as you can, but eventually to try to divide the country along class lines. And the thought of Obama's mentors was that over time, as a gradual process, if class becomes the central divide in American politics, there will be a movement toward socialism eventually.
Last couple of questions, Stanley. Alas, we're out of time. Radical in chief. Your first piece of advice, of course, is read the book. But to two groups of people, one is Republicans now considering running against Barack Obama in 2012, and the second is ordinary American voters. What one or two sentences of advice would you give to each? Prospective Republican candidates against Barack Obama, what would you say? Call him a socialist?
Well, I think you just put on the table a lot of evidence about the president's past. I think that's completely legitimate, and say there's some serious questions here. Questions that, frankly, the press ought to go to Obama and see what he has to say. I don't know that I'd entirely trust his responses, but it's legitimate, I think, to bring up a whole series of issues about his long-term intentions in light of the fact that he presents himself still to this day as a post-partisan pragmatist. To Republicans, I would say the way to combat a stealth strategy is to explode the stealth.
Okay. So the strategy that Republicans in the House have announced over the next couple of years, bill after bill after bill, send them to his desk, force him to veto them if that's the correct strategy.
And I think it's actually his strategy because, as we were saying just a bit ago, he wants there to be a kind of a clash, ultimately over class-oriented issues. He thinks he's going to win. The Republicans think they're going to win when the Bush tax cut extension comes up again, and Obama thinks he's going to win. Just as we said in an earlier segment, the Reagan people saw the movement of blacks into the suburbs as a triumph, and Obama saw it as a failure. We have really different worldviews here, even about what's politically going to work.
Stanley Kurtz, I need to repeat your name, Stanley Kurtz, author of Radical in Chief, Barack Obama and the Untold Story of American Socialism. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thank you.